What is going on, everybody, and welcome to the vlog for the week of May 13th, 2019. I hope you're all doing very well. Anyways, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about my one rule for naming your indie game. So of course, if you want to make a commercial release of your independently developed video game, you're going to need to come up with a great name for it. And I know this is something that a lot of independent developers struggle with. And actually the topic for this video was suggested by a viewer from this channel. Of course, if you have any suggestions for topics for me, or if you have any questions about game development that you think I could address in a video, feel free to drop them down in the comment section on any of my videos. And so this topic came from Astro Polsky, and he said, can you make a video on how to pick a good name for your game? I've been really struggling picking a good and unique enough name for my game. So sure thing, Astro, I definitely can. I think that's a great topic. I think a lot of independent video game developers are struggling with the same thing of creating a good and unique name for their game. So anyways, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the one rule that I have to making a good name for your game and giving you some kind of tips to how to create a name that follows that rule. And then I'm going to talk about some of the pitfalls of not following that rule. And then I'm going to go over some examples of good and bad video game names. And at the end, I'm going to be announcing the name of my May 1 game a month challenge game. So definitely stick around to the very end so you don't miss that. So anyways, let's talk about this one rule that I have for creating a name for your game. And it's an extremely simple rule. In fact, it's so simple you guys are going to be like, well, duh, yeah. But if you do follow this one rule, you will end up with a name that is good enough for your game. Now, keep in mind that having a good name is not the only thing that you need in order to have a very successful game. Of course, you need to have a good game and a good marketing strategy to build up a good audience for your game to sell it to. But having a good name is certainly an important point. So anyways, what is the one rule that I have for creating a good name for your game? It is to name your game what it is. Yep, just that. Name your game what it is. So what exactly do I mean by this? Basically, you need to know your game so well, know everything about it, know the key selling points of it and stuff. And more importantly, you need to know your target audience and what they're expecting from a game like yours. And so keeping all those things in mind, you can kind of start to formulate what a good name for your game might be. So if you have a game that centers around one person and that one person's journey, maybe you consider naming your game having something to do with that character's name. Or maybe your game kind of centers around a group of people, so you might want to consider naming your game after that group of people. Or if there's a really interesting mechanic or a certain activity that the player is primarily doing in your game, you might want to name your game after that certain activity. And then also keeping in mind your target audience and the expectations they might have for your game. You're definitely going to want to look at other games that are similar to yours and kind of take a look at how they name their games. So players kind of that are looking for that same type of game, they're going to have a certain expectations of what the game is going to be named and stuff like that. So maybe if you have like a laid back, silly, kind of relaxing type game, maybe you use kind of like a pun for your name. Puns can definitely be great because they're just kind of silly and they kind of sell the game in themselves just because it's like a little bit of a joke in there. But if your game is a more serious type game and you want to market your game as that, you want to position your game as a more serious and intense game, you know you're probably not going to want to use a pun for your title. You're going to want to use something a little bit more serious. And so for the first game that I made for my 1 game a month challenge, it was called Escape the DJ Booth. And I was kind of going around a couple different ideas for game names in my head. There was kind of like an event that was taking place in this fictional world revolving around leap year. And I was thinking of maybe doing something like that, or using the fictional DJ's name because you're kind of actually playing as the DJ. But when it really came down to it, this game is an escape the room game, and with the escape the room type games, I mean, they're pretty much always called escape the blank. So I ended up calling the game Escape the DJ Booth because that's kind of the predominant activity in the game. Sure, there's a story, and sure, you're playing as one character, but people who are looking for those types of games, they're looking for games that kind of follow that naming convention of escape the blank. So now let's talk about some pitfalls of not following this rule. So you may think that by naming your game something a little bit more generic that will It won't alienate as many people from your game, and so it might appeal to a wider audience. However, I think that's really going to end up hurting you, because people who are in your target audience, they might just skip over your game entirely because they read kind of some of this generic name and they're like, oh, that game probably isn't something that I'm interested in. And just because your game is something kind of, pretty generic, it's not going to be that interesting. So, more people are going to skip over it than give it the time of day to look into it any further to see what it actually is and see if it is something that they might be interested in. And on the off chance that you do have a generic title and someone who's outside kind of your normal target audience for your game ends up picking it up because they just don't realize, kind of what game it is, they're probably going to end up having a bad experience with your game because it's not really the type of game that they normally like to play. And then so you might end up with negative reviews or even have to deal with refunds or something like that. So just kind of avoid naming it something generic and make sure that you really name it something that really describes what your game is. If there's some activity that your player is going to be doing in your game, maybe you want to name it after that. Or again, if the story really revolves around one player or a group of players, maybe you want to name your game kind of after those main story beats. And so now I'm going to go over a couple examples of names that I think are good and a couple names that I think are pretty bad. So the first name that I think is good is the game Job Simulator. Now, this is a hilarious game. It's a VR game. The idea is the game is like kind of set in the future, and you're kind of playing as a robot who is like sort of going back in time to see what it was like to work in kind of like an office. And so it's just like a really silly game, and I think the name Job Simulator is a pretty silly name, so it's very fitting for the game. And it also literally tells you exactly what you're doing. So when I say the name Job Simulator, if you've seen any gameplay of the game, you know exactly what game I'm talking about. Now, if I were to say the name of a more generic sounding game such as Dead Space, well, that could be like any number of random kind of sci-fi games. I think a lot of sci-fi games fall into this poor kind of naming convention, just naming it something kind of generic. Like, of course, Destiny, like what the heck, that could be any number of millions of games. Or that new Bethesda game that's going to be coming out soon or within the next 10 years maybe, called Starfield. I mean, these are literally just generic and terrible names for games. And the only reason that you know what these games are, if you do, like if I say Destiny, you can picture what Destiny is, it's because they have like several hundreds of millions of dollars to pump into marketing budgets to make, different giant ads during like Super Bowl commercials and stuff like that. And chances are, if you're watching this video and you're making an independent video game, you definitely do not have a multi-million-dollar marketing budget, I can tell you that. But hopefully, if you do make a name with a great game, you can get to that point where you're making games with multi-million-dollar marketing budgets. But again, name your game what it is, not something generic, because that can cause you a lot of headaches in the future. And then one more example of a good game name that I'd like to share is Super Meat Boy. I think Super Meat Boy is a great name because it's, the character is Meat Boy, and if you just name the game Meat Boy, well, that'd be kind of weird. That could be, what kind of strange, weird games would be called Meat Boy. But again, when you put the super in front of it, it's very much like Super Mario Brothers. And of course, the game Super Meat Boy is sort of inspired from Super Mario Brothers, it being a difficult 2D platformer game. Obviously, Super Meat Boy is much more difficult than Super Mario Brothers is, but still, the name of the game Super Meat Boy kind of sets your expectations for the game, even if you've maybe never heard of the game. But if you have, of course, there is absolutely no confusing Super Meat Boy with anything else. Again, the super part of it is kind of sets it up to be like a 2D platformer. And then the Meat Boy, obviously that's the main character, Meat Boy. And he's a really memorable character. And of course, if you've played the game or seen any footage of the game at all, you're fully aware of what Super Meat Boy is. And so that's going to be a name of a game that you're never going to forget. Whereas another random sci-fi game, something like Mass Effect, you're like, okay, what the heck? Was that the one with what is going on with that? So anyways, that's the one rule that I have for developing a name for your indie game. Now to announce the title for my one game a month game for May. It's going to be called The Adventures of Rubicon Dawn. So of course, if you break this down a little bit, you'll know that I've kind of been creating adventure games lately. So that's where the adventures part comes from. And then Rubicon Dawn, you can kind of determine that the game is going to be centered around a guy named Rubicon Dawn. And so I think once you see this game and see what it's all about, things are going to start to make a little bit more sense, and you're going to kind of see how the name of the game fits very well, I think. And so just to sum it all up, your game needs to have character and a reason to exist if you want to be successful. And your game's name needs to really reflect that. So don't name your game something generic that you think might appeal to more people or it won't offend certain people. You definitely want to make your game something unique, memorable, but ultimately something that just fits your game really well and something that fits your players' expectations really well. So if you don't have an idea of what you want to name your game after watching this video, you're probably going to need to do a little bit more research, go look into other games that look like yours, as well as just taking a step back and really looking at what your game is, kind of what its main selling points are, and that can kind of give you something to build off of. Just a couple more last minute tips here if you're still watching this. I think random word generators are great. You can just go on there and just click refresh a bunch of times, and that might just give you a bunch of ideas for random little cool words that you could add in there, or give you an idea for a good pun. It's not necessarily something that you're going to come out with your title from just hitting refresh on a random generator one time. But it can be a cool idea for you to just go through and say, oh, that's a cool word, I like this. Oh, hey, that reminds me of this word. So that's something that's definitely quick and helpful. So anyways, I hope you all enjoy this video. If you did, make sure you leave this video a like. Of course, if you have any questions or comments for me, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below. And if it's good enough, maybe I will answer it in a future video. And then, of course, subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. So I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.